if you don't. So, welcome everybody. My name's Frances Gordon, and I am so delighted that you are here today to spend an hour to talk about prompting for plain language. I will be giving this talk from narratology, but I've got my wonderful friend and colleague and collaborator, CJ, here. So I'll hand over to you, CJ, and you can maybe do a little bit of an introduction.
Okay. Francis, did you want to talk about what narratology does first? Or do you want me to
You
introduce
introduce yourself
you?
and Firehead first, and then
Okay.
I'll take over.
Um, I am the founder and owner of Firehead. We are a boutique agency in Europe for digital communications, and I have worked with Francis for a long time. Our partners of our companies are partnering together now that Frances is taking her plain language skills into AI, prompting for AI. And that goes very well with Firehead because we recruit in information prompting and structured content and things for AI. And I was very honored to be invited to attend, and I'll turn it over to Frances.
Yes, and one more thing that CJ forgot to say, it's very early in the morning still, is if you have any questions throughout, please just type in the chat. And I'm hoping CJ will gather them and interrupt me if she has to, or at the end, help us with questions and answers. I'm assuming everybody can see my screen introducing narratology and Firehead. What narratology does is really, through the use of technologies and tools, helps organizations to communicate clearly. We create plain language policies, and we train content, legal, and compliance teams how to use generative AI to write, manage, and govern clear content. My specialism is financial content, and I'm very passionate about some financial inclusion, about using content to help make people healthy and happy and wealthy and wise. So that's what I do, and we'll talk more as we're going through it. So in the session, our aim and the expectation I hope I set when I wrote the intro was use prompts to produce clear, accurate, and usable custom communications in financial services. And there's kind of two main reference points I'm going to use in this talk. The one is the ISO plain language standard, which I'll introduce. And then the others is I'm going to broadly refer to financial regulations. I'm in the UK, so when I originally started, it was very much about the FCA consumer duty, but I do know that a lot of the delegates aren't from the UK. So, I'm going to talk broadly, and this isn't a compliance workshop. So we can talk broadly about kind of a consumer duty or a fairness type of financial regulation. So when I looked at who was coming, I realized people on very different levels, different paths as content people or compliance people who working with content in this new world. At the beginning, I think we all started just using Claude or ChatGPT to help us to ideate, research, draft, and edit. So that's where we kind of started. Then AI becomes a kind of helper where we use it to do accessibility checks, simple content generation, summaries, terminology checks, and so on. So it's kind of like a helper, whether that's an agent or just the language model. It kind of helps us do our job and makes us work quicker. And then we have this place, which I think very few of us are yet at, which is the promise of an agent as a digital colleague, where you get the agent itself running your content team with end-to-end content workflows and human in the loops where needed. So this talk is really much about the middle layer. So just to situate us, I'm not going to talk about just some nice prompts you can type into ChatGPT. I'm going to talk about that kind of middle layer here. So what are we going to do? We're first going to set our context, talking about plain language and talking about generative AI. Then we're going to talk about grounding, which is things you should do before you even think about prompting, really, or things you have to do as well as prompting. And then we're going to actually, in part 3, get on to actually prompting. So the last year has seen something, or maybe 2 years, has seen a collision of two amazing things for me. First was an advancement in plain language, which was the plain language standard. And second was generative AI in all its scary glory. And this talk really mixes them to and shows where I am as a plain language practitioner. And I've been doing plain language for 25 years now, so I've been doing it for a while. So I want to show you where I am with plain language and generative AI. And obviously, bringing in my main focus is financial content. So I'm going to be talking about that as well. But the context I'm going to give is for plain language and Gen AI, because I know not even all of us are in financial content. So let's talk a little bit about this ISO standard. The International Standards Organization, everyone in this room will have heard of, because they introduce standards that can be required or can be guidance for standards setting bodies around the world. The initiative for an ISO standard started back in 2009. So it's been a long time coming. And in the last 15 years or so, 25 countries have been consulted in the development of the standard. It's now that it's been published, it's translated into 14 different languages. And when it comes to the UK, parts 1, 2, and 3 have been published by the British Standards Institute. So I've got the kind of outlines on the screen on the right. So that shows they're actually standards that have been accepted by the British Standard Institute. The Science Standard also has. And then there's various parts coming out next year, but one of the really interesting and exciting part is around certification. So that there's going to be a number of different things still happening with the ISO standards. So I've been speaking, I'm also the UK ambassador for a big organization called the Plain Language Association International, or PLAIN for short. So I'm the UK ambassador for that. And as part of that role, which is a volunteer role, I speak to a lot of organizations about the standard. And the basic feedback I always get from whether they're clients or, people I'm speaking to about the standard are kind of, why? Most people say, well, I know what plain English is. They often use that word in the UK. And but what has this got to do with me? I know what plain English is, so why do I need a standard? And I always say there's two main reasons. The first one is what's plain to you isn't plain to me. We all have different versions of what plain language is. And in the past, certainly when it came to plain English, most of the plain English standards may have been biased to people whose first language was English and high literacy reading behavior. So we often find something which says, people like skimming information or scanning information. And the problem with that is for either people with low literacy or people who have low literacy for a moment in time, we often don't scan, we read in blocks. So we have different reading behavior, we have different abilities in different languages. So we have to be very careful when we do plain language that we cater for everybody and not for people like us, because as writers, we tend to have very high literacy. One of the things that I like pointing out whenever we start talking about plain language is that we all at certain moments of our lives and of our day will have low literacy. And I'm sure everybody here has one day tried to read some medical instructions or been in a rush and tried to look at directions from your phone, and you look at it and your eyes go down the page, but you didn't actually read anything. And that's because at that moment, stress or feeling not very well made our literacy level much lower and we forgot how to scan. So we all low literacy and our literacy is changing. So often those checklists, those plain English checklists weren't really fit for purpose because they're only about one type of reader in one particular context. What's more, every plain language expert had their own set of criteria and evaluation methods. So we needed a standard. So I'm not going to tell you, fast forward to actually what does the standard say about plain language. And it says plain language ensures readers can find what they need, understand it, and use it. Thus, plain language focuses on how successfully readers can use the document rather than on mechanical measures such as readability formulas. So it's got a very broad notion. And it comes up with 4 governing principles of plain language. Relevant, so readers get what they need. So we have to understand our readers. Under each of these governing principles, there's lots of different guidelines but I'm not going to go through all the guidelines because there's too many and you have to buy the standard. So, I'll just talk about the governing principles, but there is more to it than this. We have the relevance, then we have the findability, so readers can easily find what they need. So it talks about navigation, wayfinding, things like that. We talk about understandable, so readers can easily understand what they find. So that's the kind of stock standard plain language stuff, paragraphs, sentences, words. And then we have the fourth one, which is usable, which talks really to how you need to user test things with real people. So those are our governing principles. And in terms of the way I think about plain language, that's what I'm using. So that's to set that context. Another context to set is of generative AI. So what do we know or think about generative AI? And the one thing that I like talking about straight away, as I like showing this slide, John McCarthy was the engineer who really came up with the name artificial intelligence and, with this invention. And when John McCarthy organized the Dartmouth AI workshop that was in England in the 1950s, he needed to call this new field activity something. Interviewed in 2011, he said, I had to think of a name to call it, and I called it artificial intelligence. Now, later, somebody else used the term machine intelligence, and my opinion is that that would have been a better choice. And it's really interesting to think about how we defining the narrative around artificial intelligence and how different it might have been if it were called machine intelligence. So when we talk about content and Gen AI, the place where what we need to understand first is tokens, because that's the basic unit of it. So don't worry, I won't go into huge amounts of detail, and I'm going to oversimplify hugely. But the way generative AI works, as most of you know, is it takes a token, which is usually about 4 letters of a word in English, and it computes what the next token will be out of all the possible tokens in the world, and it guesses what that is. So my is the first token, favorite is the second, color is the third, and so on. And knowing about tokens is really important in terms of cost, because tokens cost money, but also in terms of a climate, because they cost water, and also just in terms of how we think of how generative AI works and how careful we've got to be in it. So I'm now going to give a very, very high level thing of how Gen AI works before we get on to the actual kind of, the promise of the workshop. So we start off, when we type into a language model, we start off by typing a prompt. And so we'll type, write an email about fee reductions. And the model then will use that prompt not alone, but also within any sort of retrieved information we've told the model about. So we might have given the model our product specs, we might have given them our style sheet, whatever we gave the model, it works that out. The model then processes the text, and it does a whole lot of clever things with vectors, but using its training, it assigns probability. So it's going to say, I think the next token is one out of these 100. And some models and some settings will say it's one of these 200, and one will say it's one of these 50, depending on how the model is set. It'll then choose the token that it's going to suggest and repeat the process and come up with an output. So I wanted to just remind us, because I know we all know this, but I wanted to remind us of how mechanistic generative AI is at its core. And it's important to kind of keep that in mind. So what does that mean for us content people? Well, I hear a lot of this, which I think is very true, that instead of designing or writing content, we are designing or writing for the generation of content, for content to be generated correctly. So it's really important that we get those skills in place so that we're not only writing for the end product, we're writing so that we can scale. And I know loads of writers and content people are quite negative towards AI in a way. And for me, and why I'm very interested in it, is I'm interested in anything that can scale plain language, anything that can make plain language available to more organizations more of the time so that they can pass this amazing universal, what I think of as a universal accessible accommodation It's a universal accessibility accommodation. So they can pass that on to the end users. So if we can use AI to scale this, I think this is fantastic. And that's why my interest in. My interest isn't just as for technology's sake. I came up with this idea of purposeful patterns to describe what I really want to do, and I think what content people actually should be doing, because we know that when we're generating content, we're doing it according to patterns, according to algorithms, as I explained, according to computing of tokens, and if we are purposeful about those patterns, perhaps we can create great benefits for our end users out there who will benefit from plain language. But if we don't, if we kind of let the patterns just develop themselves, then that's when I think we're going to have a lot of problems with ethics and with hallucinations and with data leaks and with all of this other stuff. So what I'm very interested in is thinking about purposeful patterns that are creative, but also risk aware. So, what does that mean for Gen AI and prompting? I put the summary slide right at the start to dive straight into it before actually going into any of the details, because I think it might also help to set the scene. So, this is the last slide about context that I'm going to give. And you can see there's on the left is a green, then there's an amber in the middle, and then there's a red on the right. And so on the left, it says, well, what can we? Note I say can. I don't say should. I don't say must, but can. We can use AI perhaps for checking predictable linguistic patterns or flagging potential issues for human review. So we can do word level checks. We can do sentence structure checks. We can create red flags for information architecture. We can say, there's no alt text on this, or we can say things aren't tagged correctly, or there's too many levels of hierarchy. We can also create structural red flags, like looking for buried information. And that, in my experience, what I'm doing now, that's for me, that's a can. The kind of amber is drafting content that's repeated at scale with predictable changes and can be human reviewed. So if you think of financial documents or like investment documents, you think of summaries, you think of key facts, that kind of prominent information that's brought out of a document. You think of variants for different channels or different segments, so we can scale, we can personalize content much more easily than ever before. And then maybe contextual tone shifts. Why it's a may is we're going to have to tell the AI exactly what to do, because left to its own devices, it can't do this. But with the right guardrails, maybe we can start doing it. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is around the amber middle, because I think that's the really interesting bit at the moment. And then there's stuff that I think we know we must not rely on AI for. Researching who the customer is or what motivates them. Final compliance sign-offs or approval. Very important, tagging customers as vulnerable, having any kind of vulnerability or disability without evidence or consent. So we're all concerned about those inferences that may be made with unfair patterns or unfair algorithms. So we don't want to use AI to do that. Or any decision or rollout without proper testing and monitoring. So I think there's lots of things to unpack on what we should or shouldn't use AI for. So I've set the context now, and I'm going to talk a little bit more now about grounding. And grounding is kind of what you should do before prompting. And I'm using the term very generically, so all you have lots of experience with generative AI will be able to put the jargon on, but I'm going to really try and not use too much jargon here. This might mean oversimplify a little bit. So when we think about what we have to do in our work as plain language content people, we have to prompt, so we shape the instruction, but we also have to ground, so we have to give the facts and constraints that we do not want the model to guess. We don't want the model to guess like what our product specs are. I also don't think we want our model to guess what our style sheet is, or what our terminology guidelines are, or how long a sentence should be. So the grounding is the things we tell the model as a constraint. And we need to figure the grounding out. If we don't figure the grounding out, then prompting doesn't really work very well. It can't work very well. So grounding is about that structured information that we give to the model so that the prompts actually work. And you can think of grounding as manual. So if you're just typing into ChatGPT or Claude, in which case you or your team will collect all the facts. So every time you want to write something, you'll collect the right part of the terminology guideline or the tone guideline. You would then paste these above or below the prompt or put them into the API, and then the model will use what you've given to write the text. You can use it through something called retrieval augmented generation, when the model gets the information, retrieves the verified resource, and that's connected, and that's when the model connects automatically to approved sources that hold the same facts. And it's all automatic. So as you prompt, the system searches approved sources and selects what it needs to find, the snippets it needs. And it'll use that again to generate the content. So that's what kind of grounding is. And when I look at those, remember those four governing principles of the ISO plain language standard: relevant, findable, understandable, usable. And I think, what do I want to give to the model? Think, what don't I want the model to kind of guess? What do I want there to be precision about? And that's kind of what you've got to start thinking of as potential for grounding information. So when it comes to the reader, insights about the reader and context. Well, I'm in a very specific culture writing for a specific group of people, so I don't want assumptions made of that. I want to ground my what I know about my readers. That's one thing I want. Then when it comes to making things findable, I want to ground some patterns around cognitive load, information architecture, structural clarity, and visual sensory design. I'm going to go through these, but just to give you an idea. Then for understandable, what do I want to ground? Well, certainly my terminology, or my, whatever you want to call it, or vocabulary guidelines. I certainly want to ground that. How I'm going to define those terms of art in a legal contract, how I'm going to use, simple terms and not complex words. I want to ground that. I want that. Just as I did when I was, when we were doing editorial resources by hand in a long Word document or in a Google sheet. We need to now give them to the model, and they can scale it, right? Sentence structure, language efficiency, and so on. And then for usable, we will want to give protocols for user testing and inclusive design. So we're not talking about synthetic users here. We're talking about protocols, methods, and things like that. That's what we want to ground. So I'm going to go through a little bit around this, and I'm going to go through it quite quickly, but hopefully you'll find it works for you. And just a reminder, you're welcome to type any comments or questions in the chat. So when it comes to relevance, what grounding information will your prompts need? Well, audience profiles, any constraints related to journeys or products, and then vulnerability related needs and adaptations mapped to journeys, products, and audience. And I'm going to show a little bit of examples of this. So if I think of the personas I would create before AI, right? You created audience personas. Most of us in this room, I think, will know one. To me, in my experience, what we can do now is we can create more of them if we want to, because we can manage more of them. And we can encode a lot of information in our personas. So here's an example of what we can include: the name of the segment or persona, the description, so who's included, who would be excluded, typical life events, motivations, base financial literacy and knowledge. Now that has to be researched with real people, right? But once you've got those insights, that becomes part of your grounding information. It becomes part of your grounding information for that first governing principle, right, of the persona. Base literacy and numeracy skills. And we know most plain language people, including me, don't really like these readability scores. But in terms of giving you a maximum, so you'll say you'll never write above a grade 8, I don't think there's any harm in that, because we're not relying on it. It's just one of many kind of things that we're using. So although we know we should never only use or rely on readability, it would be a big, big mistake to do that. I think as part of a very big triage toolkit, it can be just part of a very big picture. So we talk about plain, literacy levels, numeracy skills that will obviously be affected by journey and context, which we'll come to. Digital literacy or confidence, language references, and by language references we mean actually what literal language is used or is preferred, but we also mean all of those plain language principles that we all know so well, like active voice and like not using all those redundant phrases and so on. So all that stuff that fits in there. Tone references. And why that word references is in there is you don't put the actual language or tone under or tone description within that audience. You will have, just like you did really differently, you'll have a separate system that interacts with this grounding information so you can combine your tone, but you do need to know what is the kind of default tone to use with this audience. And then you'll talk about accessibility and your researched vulnerability drivers and references. You'll talk about attitudes towards money, attitudes towards risk, decision styles, and behavioral tendencies. So how a particular, from your research, if you have found a particular persona tends to rely on defaults more than another, then that can be also used to make this persona that much richer and help the model to evaluate documents better. Trust and help-seeking behaviors, which is very important to regulators around how disclosure and consent is given. And then obviously channel preferences. Do they prefer phone or email or an app notification? So all of these things can be now used as grounding information, as one element of these guardrails that we use. And I just want to stress here, what I'm not saying is that you let the AI decide how financially literate somebody is. So this is done by research, but then it's given to the AI as grounding information. Another great use is around monitoring and evaluation, which is so important certainly to the Financial Conduct Authority at the moment. So again, we can look at specific M&E, which again will help build the system of plain language that will be able to be prompt later on. In the same way, we have grounding for comms journeys, like onboarding journeys. So for every onboarding journey, we do know we've got our set points, and then we've got classifications like purpose, timing, critical info, channel, and exit. I put this in code form just to show you that it has to be structured data grounding, right? Because otherwise we won't have the schemas for the model to use it when it's prompt. Then we have something that's really interesting around vulnerable personas. And I'm going to read the definition of a vulnerable persona because I know if you're not in the UK, it might not be a word or a term that you used to hearing. I'm not sure how international the term is. But according to the Financial Conduct Authority, which is the financial regulator in the UK, they say a vulnerable customer is someone who, due to their personal circumstances, is especially susceptible to harm, particularly when a firm is not acting with appropriate levels of care. And then they say it's a spectrum of risk, and everyone's at risk of becoming vulnerable at some time, but you're more at risk if you've got characteristics like poor health, cognitive impairments, disabilities, low resilience, and it names a whole lot of other characteristics. And for grounding for vulnerability, what one can look at is barriers, enablers. So what is really difficult, it might be, waiting for something. Enablers, required adaptations, risks if misunderstood. So risks if a vulnerable person doesn't understand that debt warning or debt notice. How are you going to test? So that's a really interesting thing for the AI to kind of know, to be able to tell your team how you should test and how you should monitor. I do want to say there's a lot, in my mind, a lot of potential for misunderstanding and maybe almost overusing AI here. So the idea is that I don't think one should ever infer vulnerability labels or needs. So one shouldn't ever go and look at someone's behavior and go, well, therefore they are vulnerable. Because that would be an inference, which would be unfair and would have been done without that person's consent. So you must focus on needs and adaptations, not traits or labels. So you're not really allowed even to label somebody as vulnerable. It has to be either with their consent or maybe through a particular event trigger. So if they're going to through a kind of claiming a life policy or something, then you could maybe with caution infer some information. You could use proper research and outcomes and user tests and so on. But so you have to be careful of how you're inferring that. So you can do all this grounding, but you can't associate that grounding with a particular person unless that person has given you clear consent to do so. There are guardrails one can put in around vulnerability, like telling the model to abstain, to not make any inferences if they're not 100% sure. So maybe it's not making any inferences unless the customer has given express consent for that. So we don't want to produce content in a way that assumes a vulnerability when the customer hasn't given that consent. So I think that's an important thing for plain language when it comes to the readers. So that's the basics of the reader bit. I'm going to look at the findable bit. So what grounding information is needed? The first thing around cognitive load would be really rules like put familiar before unfamiliar information, right? Have one idea per sentence. Really important cognitive load issues. Information architecture like information layering. So have you layered when there's lots of information? Is it layered? Is there progressive disclosure? And all of that can be grounding. We don't need to leave that up to chance. Structural clarity, like the maximum number of steps in a process. And then visual or sensory design. We often like talk a lot about visual design, but we also are talking, about not only people who use screen readers, but also podcasts and all of these different ways that we are now consuming information. So if there are any particular guardrails or rules about that, those should be given as grounding. Now we have to add the understandable, which if you're like me and any kind of plain language person, we secretly just love. We all love this stuff, these long lists of the, complex word and how we can make it simple, the commencement, and we can make that start, and assistance, we can make help. We love all these long lists. We love these lists of jargon and how we can replace the jargon with a simpler term. What acronyms we're going to let stay being acronyms and which acronyms we must spell out. All of that stuff that was in our files and we couldn't get anyone to look at. Now we can actually get the model to look at it and use it, which is amazing, which is really nice. Sentence structure, the same thing. Language efficiency, so the redundancies that we have, especially in English, and then the normalizations that are also used in more kind of academic texts that we do not want in plain language, we'll also get rid of. This isn't a workshop just about plain language, and I think most of the people here will kind of know these principles quite well. So I haven't focused on them. I'm going to focus a little bit on voice and tone, though, because I think it's quite interesting to see how AI can scale voice and tone. So I don't know if any of you have tried this. You probably have. When you type, because there's all the stuff all over the internet of how good it is. When you type in, write this in a friendly way, or write this in a professional way, and there's all these APIs that go to the tools that do this. And I don't know about you, I rarely, it doesn't appeal to me at all. And because I think it's very culturally biased. I think it appeals maybe to a specific culture, a specific age, a specific country. I don't think it really works because I do think that the model needs to be trained with your particular culture. And if you haven't got masses of training data, if that's not going to happen for you with masses of training data, or if you're using, one of the open models, then you can give it the rules. So what I've done is I create little GPTs And I've got one, and I can tell it now to write in a sincere tone or an excited tone, depending what brand I'm working for. And the GPT goes and looks at these rules. So I know exactly what I'm doing. I know what I mean by sincere and what I mean by excitement. And this is where, if you are a linguist, like I know both me and CJ have linguistic backgrounds. CJ far more clever than me, but we both got linguistic backgrounds, and that's when you can really use your linguistics to kind of build those rules. So you're not relying just on training data that might not be culturally relevant to your audience. The AI slop, as we call it. You would all know as writers, it's not only the brand voice, the kind of brand you are, it's also that tone needs to ebb and flow and change contextually. So most of you will have done a tone matrix at some point in your life. So I've got a really simple one here with relationship on the horizontal and expertise on the vertical. So what I'm saying is in the top left, high expertise, distant relationship, tech documentation. You don't want much personality in there. It's objective, very high expertise. But if you're writing to a private investor, a birthday card, you're not really using a lot of jargon in it, but you are writing, you know, you can refer to you whatever you want to refer to, and it can be quite close because you've got personal relationship with that person. So once you have got all of this matrix work done, what I do is I use AI to then help me create the rules for low, medium, high of, you know, of the different sort of poles that I'm working with. Then the combination of the sincere and the excitement and the tone context, the AI found, the model, even in a little GPT, is able to emulate tone really well, which it can't do if you're just saying, please be friendly, you know, whatever. Um, for usable, we're really talking around protocols for testing and for research. Right, I've got 20 minutes left. Yay. I want to leave a little bit of time at the end for some questions too. So I'm going really fast, but I will share the recording and then you can go through it at your own pace as well. So now we get on to prompting. And I hope you get, I hope you understand that why I did it this way. That unless you ground, unless you spend time thinking of what information, what structured information you're going to give that model, then your prompts are a little bit up to that model getting that right token. So you want to get the actual information there. Otherwise, to be honest, you'll spend more time reviewing and getting things right than you did before AI. So how do we think about prompting? And a lot of people, there's so much literature on prompting, right? But some of the literature that we look at uses this concept of a prompt block, which I really love. So a prompt block is a small part of a prompt that you can reuse, and reuse saves time and builds consistency. So it's just like, to me, when I was managing a team of writers, if I didn't give them any brief, really, or I gave them, or I wrote different briefs to each one, I couldn't expect them to be consistent because, you know, they just wouldn't be consistent. So this way we can make sure that the model is also consistent because things are reused. And just to bear in mind always, the real aim is not to make the perfect prompt. It's to help customers make their effective, timely, and properly informed decisions, or whatever the end goal is. It's not to try and create the hugest prompt library in the world. But prompt blocks are useful. So these are the ones that I've used for financial content. And I was looking at this and I was looking at all the prompt frameworks. There's these ones that are kind of structured in you know, more, I suppose, flowing ways than this, but these are the ones that I found work. So role, task, examples, audience journey, mandatory content, because that's really important for financial content. We've always got that mandatory content, and there's a lot. The order of things, wording of things, and then simple checks at the end, which I'll explain, which is quite a nice concept. So our prompt blocks, the whole idea behind them is you have these are kind of categories. You will then write a whole lot of, for instance, audience personas. So you will write this as a persona X, which is a carer who has a current account and an investment account. That's who I'm writing for. And then all of the other things might be generic. Then I can just switch audience, and now I'm writing for a young adult who's got their first savings account. But the rest of the prompts can stay the same if I'm talking about the exact same journey, the exact same mandatory content, the exact same wording, descriptions, and so on. You might find that some of remember the audience had different references to our tone guidelines. I don't know if you remember that, but so it might draw on different tone guidelines, but it might be that the rest of the wording stays exactly the same. So I hope you can see what doing blocks does is it's a kind of modular way of building a prompt. So you're reusing as many prompts as you can in different to create a different picture. So you can also have persona 3 with a different journey. If our first journey was an onboarding journey, with persona 2 now I might want to use a different persona or the same one and start with a consent journey. I might want to start with a slightly different set of wording because perhaps I'm writing now to legal practitioners and not to customers. So the way you do this is all about reuse, and it's all about efficiency in the same way that we chunked our content, really. So I'll take you through some of these a little bit. One line that's set. So the role is, we all know this. You're a plain language writer for UK retail banking. You apply ISO plain language principles and FCA consumer duties expectations, and also pay attention to brand voice and tone. So that's the kind of thing you could say. For me, if you specified everything else, I'm not sure it's as important than if you specify nothing else. But where things are ambiguous, that's when the role, I think, does become quite important. And there would probably be a difference between if you're a compliance person or a UX writer. The task, I'm just going to read it through because I think most of you will know this, like how to write a task. Write a communication to explain there's a fee change so readers can decide whether to switch products by 1st of October. So I like, this is more for when it's a kind of customer one. You'd have guidelines, so write about the output for which decision by which time. I like for which decision because it also fits in very nicely with financial regulations that always talk about making informed decisions. So the FCA talks about that a lot. Examples help the model to understand the pattern you want it to use. There's a lot you can find out just from searching. One really good resource to learning how to do examples, if you want to learn more about this idea of zero shot or few shot, or bigger sets of examples, is Anthropic itself. So if you go to the prompting guidelines or the prompting library in Anthropic, they've got some really cool, useful, practical things to say about how to give examples. And then with the audience, remember, when you're doing your prompt, you're not writing reams of stuff about the audience. You're just really referring to the persona. And perhaps if you want to build an exceptional use case for that persona, you're going to talk about that. But you're not having every writer in your team, having to do that because you're going to have consistency. The same with journey. So remember, journeys were given a grounding. And why that's so nice is the ISO standard for plain language talks about the context of reading. So it specifically says, you must understand, the context. The FCA links the channel or timing as well to testing and prominence, how prominent information is. So that's really important. Mandatory content. Anyone who knows financial content knows there's sometimes actual prescribed wording, but often there's just kind of, content that you need to have in particular communication. And that's very good to do, in a prompt. If it's really generic, you can maybe have it as grounding, but I think, because it's so important, it's quite nice to have as part of the prompt. Same with information order. I also think there is value. There's a lot of value in having the writer think through the information order rather than having it just generated. So I think there is value of having that in the prompt as well. But again, this is something you would decide when you're figuring out your plain language, how you're going to do plain language, where how you're going to think about this type of information. As I say, I would have it as part of the prompt. And then the wording rules, you're giving exceptions to your word list and other specifications that you already figured out. And you can also specify which sections of a style guide apply to this communication. So you're not trying to do everything from scratch in a prompt, you're referring to grounding information, which you keep consistent. Otherwise, I find personally it just becomes really messy and the model itself starts generating really inconsistent content. I've certainly found that unless I make a big deal out of the word lists, it just strays and everything becomes very inconsistent. And remember, inconsistent terminology is the enemy of plain language, the complete enemy of it. It really messes up our understanding when we have two words that mean the same thing or one word that can mean three different things. And then the final area of the prompt is a simple check. So you can say something in your like this in your prompt, list the mandatory facts included. So you could say like, this is what, this is what I told you to say. Come up with 3 or true false questions a customer should have to answer correctly, because remember, the model knows what their financial literacy is, and knows what the base knowledge was. And then if any fact is missing or unclear, say what to fix. This is definitely not user testing. Emphasizing again, I don't really think plain language works well with synthetic users, but it does just weed out the big mistakes of things you really haven't got across, and it just allows you as the person, the adult in the room, the person in the room, to see that there isn't a big mistake. There's no use going through a human in the loop check, if there's something major, because if the model is picking up something like this, it'd be a major mistake. So it's no use running through your whole check if there's a content flag like this. So I've got an example here. We got 10 minutes. So you can see that your prompting in this way, your prompt becomes quite short and sweet, actually, if you've got all the grounding information nicely structured and correct. Because what you don't want to do, and I think it happens to a lot of us that work by ourselves a lot, is we've suddenly realized we're spending more time writing our prompts than actually would have taken to actually do the work. So we have to be efficient with our prompts. Otherwise, if it is a one-off that your writer's just doing for themselves, I don't see much value in using generative AI. I was speaking to another practitioner a few days ago, and she was designing these beautiful, very complicated timelines to show financial growth and all sorts of things. And she asked me, she said, well, how would you use AI for this? And my only answer was, maybe for research, but I can't see any use, because if you're doing something one-off that you've got time and budget to do beautifully, why would you do it with AI? AI is for things at scale. Remember that first slide that I showed? It's for things with predictable patterns and things that we think will lead to a good by scaling them up. They're not for very specialized skills that you've got the time and money for. In fact, if we can save time and money on these kind of pedestrian, predictable communications through AI, maybe we can actually have more of the highly specialized, really artisanally crafted information designer, collaborative kind of projects. So I think AI is for, when things are predictable. They're not for wanting to get surprises. So that's really where the thinking behind this beautiful pattern of the corporate identity of narratology came from. This idea of all these little pieces that we did in the groundings, all these little shapes that you saw in the top right coming together, shifting one or two things and coming up with Something that you might not have predicted, but it still makes sense. It still kind of works because you have the kind of system right. So, 9 minutes left. I thought we'd spend the last bit having a bit of a discussion, um, and I'm taking any questions. And one of the things that I've been doing in the background is working on a kind of plain language assessment tool using AI because I remember I do think that you can, not should, but can get a lot of use from AI to using, you get a lot of use from AI in the kind of checking and evaluation of content and a shared understanding of what plain language is through that process. Um, so in the last bit, we can have a discussion, and if there's no discussion points, I'll ask CJ if she has any questions. The narratology kind of plain language assessment platform very much in beta form at the moment, but what it does is it allows you to create and do your own assessment. I don't quite have time to do assessments in one live, but I want to show you one that's done. So what I'll show you on this one, because others it takes they're a bit too messy, but I've got vocabulary, sentence structure, and language efficiency. And what this can do is it can take any document and produce a very good kind of assessment and advice on it according to plain language principles. Guys, I will send you on your way to your beautiful, some of you in beautiful South African sun. So I'll send you on your way into that, and have a great Friday. I'll end the call then. Bye bye.
Goodbye, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Francis.
Thanks.